Let's see. Okay, so the Twitter space is now open.
Okay, great.
For those who prefer that, I know some people do. And let's see. I was on a very long flight, so I missed a whole lot of news. So I'm counting on everybody else to kind of update on what the hell's going on. The market is rallying. Okay, I guess that means there's some positive indications around Ukraine potentially. I don't know. Let's find out. Let's go.
Maybe Ken knows.
That's crazy. There has been a lot of a mixed message, right? Yesterday I heard a lot of the Sunday CNN talk shows talking about the Turkish, talking about that progress has been made. There might be a little bit of talk, but they're just waiting to see if the two parties are a little bit closer so that they would have more productive discussions. But then I was in Petor's room, and then they were talking about that just. Just today, Russia rejected, I think, any kind of talks because they don't think there is any point to it. So it is a mixed message. So I don't know what's happening.
So I just did a little search for Ukraine news, and the first thing that came up was BBC. Russia. The headline from BBC says Russia trying to starve Mariupol into surrender, and that's a city that's very close to the Russian border, and the one that has received the most aggressive bombing, and they've surrounded it, and they're not letting anything in or out. And the mayor there said exactly this: that people, there's hundreds of thousands of people still. It's a very large city, and that unless something unless something drastic happens soon, these hundreds of thousands of people will starve to death. 300,000 people are believed to be trapped there without supplies, and aid blocked from entering. Residents have endured weeks of Russian bombardment with no power or running water. No water or energy, folks. Look at that. No food or water or energy. It turns out if you don't have food or water or energy, it turns out it's actually, for some people, it's kind of a problem if you don't have food or water or energy. And these 300,000 people without food or water or energy, apparently they're gonna die, is the headline here from the BBC.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because even this morning I read article that the Russians did ask them if they wanna surrender, but the people, the official counselors and stuff said no. So I guess they are trying to take a drastic measure to force them into surrendering, I guess.
Says residents have endured weeks of Russian bombardment. There was no, he said there's no question of surrendering. Quote, Russians don't open humanitarian corridors. They don't let humanitarian convoys enter the city. And we clearly see now that the goal of the Russians is to start to create hunger in the city to enforce their position in the diplomatic process. Quote, if the city does not surrender, and the city will not surrender, they won't let people out. They won't let humanitarian convoy into the city. Under the proposal, which Ukraine had until 5 o'clock Moscow time, which is 2 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, or UK time, Russian troops would have opened safe corridors out of Mariupol, initially for Ukraine troops and foreign mercenaries to disarm and leave the city. After 2 hours, Russian forces say they would then have allowed humanitarian convoys with food, medicine, and other supplies to enter the city safely once the demining of the roads was complete. Very interesting. That's an interesting detail. And someone's got an open mic there. Who else? Ken.
It's Ken. It's Ken.
Oh. Okay, there you go.
Sorry about that. Okay. So interestingly, Mariupol has mined the perimeter, so the Russians can't really come in. Boy, what a tricky predicament there. They're surrounded. No supplies can come in. You need a whole lot of food and water sources for those 500,000 people. Now, if there's a river running through the city, then they can have water. If there was a lot of farms, they could have food, or a whole lot of urban farming. I'm trying to imagine potential solutions here. Basically, you're going to need some kind of military force to break open the surrounding of the city, to open a corridor to bring in aid. I mean, that's
Tyler,
yes,
I have a question.
yeah.
I mean, with the drone technology, could they like take and drop off bags of rice into like the city center? Is that
No,
have it? No.
not really. You're going to need some, because that's heavy. Bags of rice are incredibly heavy, and I'm speaking to somebody who's carried bags of rice because I have a rice farm in Thailand.
What about some other food source that could be lifted by drones?
Food
I
is really
think
heavy. Drones don't carry heavy items very well.
the
Go ahead.
question is if they have a clear the air space that I mean the Russians have been doing all this bombing from the air, so they probably have that side of the airspace. So otherwise, I know that in the humanitarian crisis time here in Africa as well, they sometimes just airdrop, food items and things like that. I don't know about rice or this or that, but they do airdrop sometimes when they run out of other options.
Yeah, well, the Russians have control of the airspace and the ground space. So you're right that you could try and sneak something in at night, kind of low flying drones, but now you're talking maximum like 100 kilograms per drone per visit. That ain't gonna cut it at all, not even close. So not with 300,000 people.
But I think there is the bigger strategy, right? I mean, Russians' original plan was to encircle Kiev, and now they are trying to just do with Mariupol and then maybe cut off and connect with, that space at the bottom, I guess, with Crimea and Donetsk and stuff like that by taking off, I guess, Mariupol. So I'm thinking, is this a strategic change from Russia's perspective? And also, if they are abandoning trying to encircle Kiev, which they couldn't do for a while now, would Ukraine be in a position to push them out and also go from defensive to offensive? That's something I don't know if that's even a possibility that Ukraine is thinking to do, because they refused to surrender as of today anyway.
Right. It says, should Russia capture Mariupol, it would help to create a land corridor between the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, controlled by Russian-backed separatists, and Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. So far, though, Mariupol's defenders have stood firm. There are mounting concerns about the humanitarian situation, with a Ukrainian MP from Mariupol calling it hell on earth. Residents spend most of their time in shelters and basements as Russia continues its unrelenting attack on the city from land, air, and sea. Pictures show a city in ruins with entire neighborhoods devastated. The mayor estimated that over 80% of residential buildings had either been damaged or destroyed. Oh, Jesus. A third of them beyond repair. Bodies are being left in the streets as it's too dangerous to get them. Mr. Gurin said teams were still unable to clean up the rubble of a theater, which Ukrainian officials said was bombed by Russia last Wednesday. Hundreds of people are believed to remain trapped in the basement, which withstood the attack. Moscow denies targeting the building. I learned something interesting in the past 24 hours about the bombing of the theater in Mariupol, and I wonder if anyone else saw this. I think Ian Bremmer tweeted this, that on one day last week. I believe it was something like March 13th or 14th or 15th. Outside the theater, in very large letters, they wrote in the Cyrillic alphabet, the Russian Ukrainian alphabet, the words children in very large letters so that you could see it from the sky if you're a pilot. It just says the word children in very large letters written on the ground in front of the theater. Specifically like you would if you were on a deserted island and you would write SOS in the sand in coconut leaves or whatever, to try and let an airplane flying overhead to let them know that you're a human there. And, in a similar way, they wrote in front of this big theater, children, which is 4 letters.
Not only in front of it, they had it in the back as well. So if you come from the north, you saw it. If you come from the south, you saw it. If you come from the east and the west, you could see both of the signs on the front and the back of the theater.
Now,
this is really, really bad one.
Now, there's photographic evidence of this. Okay? There's photographic evidence of whatever day that was. Call it March 14th. I believe that is about right. And then 2 days later, call it March 16th, 17th, whatever, 48 hours later, that building was bombed flat. Like, it turns in, it's now a big hole in the ground, essentially. And so whoever bombed that building bombed it knowing that there was very huge letters that they could very easily read from any direction that says children, in 5,000 point font or 50 million point font in front of and behind that theater. So that is going to be probably one of the strongest arguments for people who want to hold Russia accountable for war crimes. So that was
I sent you the picture with it. You could
clearly
see it.
It's starting to go viral as it should. What else? There's been a bunch of interesting smaller developments since we met last time over the weekend, and I'm curious if anyone else noticed any other interesting details like that. Certainly Mariupol is a developing tragedy, and that could be a preview, a foreshadowing of how things will continue to develop, because this is Russia showing its strategy in one particular city, and this is the first city that's really suffering the consequences of Russia's ground and air game. And we can assume that that same strategy will be deployed in other cities if they if things escalate. So that's why this is of a concern, because now you've got 300,000 people in a humanitarian crisis unwilling to surrender, and residents spend most of their time in shelters. Pictures show the city in ruins. We covered all that. That says, here's another quote. Mr. Gurin said teams were still unable to clean the rubble of the theater. Quote, the services cannot clean this rubble because the shelling never stops and the bombing never stops. It's really dangerous, he said. He could not give an estimate on how many people had managed to flee the area, as we don't have a connection. And they're making mass graves. Since the war began, authorities say at least 2,500 people have been killed in the city. Though the true number may be higher, previous efforts to evacuate civilians have been blocked by Russian fire, which has been caught on video. Although local authorities say that thousands have been able to leave in private vehicles. On Sunday, the Ukrainian deputy prime minister said about 4,000 people had fled from Mariupol. And President Zelensky had said the Russian siege amounts to a war crime. This is totally deliberate tactic, he said. The Russian forces have a clear order to do absolutely everything to make the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine cities an argument for Ukrainians to cooperate with the occupiers. Okay, so that's a very intense scenario that we'll have to keep an eye on. That's an in-progress development there. Anybody else? There's a guy on Twitter. I'm trying to remember his account that is getting a whole lot of followers during this because he's doing some incredible. He's kind of a war strategist expert, and he's doing he has this really brilliant way of kind of analyzing what's going on and giving constant updates. I'll find the name momentarily. And he gave his kind of weekly update on how things are going from his perspective. And he is actually, and he's doing a lot of calculations. And by his calculations, Ukraine is actually holding up quite well from the big picture of things. That Russia is not making the level of progress that it should, and that if you had to sort of pick a winner from last week, that in terms of who's getting the upper hand, because and this is a very important question, who in the past few days is making, whose side is quote unquote making more progress, winning or losing, you can't really say, right? But I mean, who's gaining and who's not in the past few days? Because if you're the one that's gaining at this moment, then the negotiations go in your favor. That's why that's such an important question. And from his perspective, Ukraine is currently the one gaining lately, in part because of the new ammunitions that are coming into Ukraine from the U.S. bases in Germany and Poland, and others, of course. I mean, everyone in the Western world is contributing in their own ways. And these new munitions are reaching the Ukrainians, and that's having a strong impact on Russian vehicles and tanks and planes. And so the economic costs and the number of tanks and planes that are becoming inoperable is starting to get very significant and very costly for Russia. And that at the current rate, Russia's already lost 10% of all their tanks, of all Russian tanks, are now disabled. And so at the current rate, meaning in the past week, if the past week rate continues, they'll be out of tanks in about 2 to 3 months, completely, all Russian tanks, and a whole lot of airplanes. So that to me is very interesting, because now the Ukraine side has been given a lot of anti-tank, anti-airplane armaments, which they're able to deploy, which is gonna, if things continue as current as in the past week, Russia will be out of tanks and airplanes and essentially be in a really difficult situation militaristically in about 2 months. Now, as I said, before Russia ever invaded, before they ever even crossed the border, that this would likely be the dream of all dream scenarios for the United States of America. The dream scenario is that Russia gets itself into a quagmire in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians fight them off to a standstill, and slowly but surely just drain Russia, and Russia just gets drained, and their military gets slowly ground into dust, and the country economically is ground into dust, and Russia itself, in every which way, just becomes the next North Korea. And that's what's happening. That's exactly what's happening, and that's exactly what America wants to happen and to keep happening. And that's an interesting problem. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we both follow Peter Zahan, and I'm in my car, so I can't play any of the stuff. But from his most recent update, he said that since the start of the invasion, the Russians have lost more soldiers than we lost in the entire 20 years of Afghanistan, or that we're close, or something like that. I don't have it in front of me. But the other thing he said is that, in that escalation ladder that we talked about, going to nukes. Well, as a power like Russia gets embarrassed and humiliated, that pushes them closer to, okay, what are their remaining options if it comes down to a scenario like you're talking about.
We're losing you, Frank. Or Jorge, sorry.
Which means that it becomes even more dangerous.
You are in the matrix.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, try again. No, we cannot.
How about now?
There you go.
Good.
Is this better?
Yes, that's way better. Yeah.
Okay, we lost you again.
I'm in a dead spot. Sorry.
Come back in 5 minutes. I got an update. Okay. Frank, are you in the Twitter space or are you in the Clubhouse? Frank, can you please, do you want to share what you just shared with me? This is breaking news.
Yeah, it's breaking news that actually Russia is shelling Odessa from ships right now. It's just a video coming in. It's I read it on the magazine. It's a German magazine, Catapult, and they engage actually Ukrainians. So Ukrainian journalists are working on this German media outlet, and they have all the contacts. So they posted a video, and that's signaling the air sirens for the shelling. So right now there's a shelling on Odessa.
So let me.
Yeah, they were also even shooting at people who were protesting. So I think, like Frank, oh,
So that is the siren that just started 8 minutes ago in Odessa. An air raid alert sound in Odessa. Russian ships are shelling the city, and this is very concerning. This is, as I've pointed out again, kind of from the early days of this. Odessa is in many ways the queen or even king on the chessboard. Economically, strategically, in terms of ultimate value, it even outranks Kyiv in many ways, because it's the way that all of Ukraine trades with the world. It's through the Black Sea and all of its exports and imports, and this is just beyond critical. And I've been there. And I've talked to the Ukrainian former military gentlemen who stand guard on every street corner. Years ago, before they've been anticipating this day for many years, and have been willing. And I could tell during my visit, which was during a time of peace, that they knew this day was going to come someday, and that they would need to fight to the death to defend this city that they love. And that was my question to them, as I tried to enjoy that city, knowing. But I just want to try and paint the picture of what such an interesting scenario as a tourist. It's quite a lovely city, I have to say. Lovely restaurants, a lovely park in the center of the city, and I have to say quite likable people there, and I really enjoyed my time there. However, it was hard to escape the phantom or dark cloud hanging over the city in the form of older gentlemen standing guard on every single street corner, and I mean that very literally. And they were in their uniforms and they're retired. Some of these were senior citizens, even quite elderly, some of them. And in any case, they were positioned and patrolling every street corner. And of course, that causes a tourist to ask many questions. I've never seen anything like that in my life, and I've traveled to many, many cities. And of course, I'm a very curious person on these types of things. And so I asked several of them, what the heck's going on, and They've known that this day would come at some point, and they knew they would have to fight, and they knew then, years ago, that when this day came, and that day is today, that day is right now, this moment just started live 10 minutes ago. The air horn just went live 10 minutes ago, that the shelling has begun, and these people have known that they are going to fight to the death over this. They already made that decision years ago. And that was my question. And that question was answered. And just just the concept of knowing you're going to have to fight for your freedom years in advance, and knowing you're going to have to risk your life to keep your independence from a kind of an aggressive neighbor, and then to what an environment. It's tragic, and I believe that I'm guessing here that Russia has waited until now on Odessa, because I think they know Odessa is going to be much harder than anything they've encountered thus far. Because they have to know, their intelligence, Russian intelligence, must have warned that Odessa is going to be a tough nut to crack. And I've even seen other analysts kind of make that point as well. And I gathered that firsthand on the ground there myself years ago. Anyway, anyone else with a thought, go ahead.
I think they have tried. I don't think that, yes, the shelling is starting, but there have been experts talking about that. They have been really trying to choke that off, because they knew that even the resupplying of weapons coming from the West are getting through that corner. So I think they have tried, but they are going to give it like a bigger effort at this time. But otherwise, they tried. Even a smaller village before Odessa that they have been trying to get into, and that the Ukraine has been trying to push them back out. So they haven't been successful so far to get there. But yeah, I think they are trying to even stretch out to Ukraine with the Mariupol being hit so bad now, like you said, a third or something to be unusable. Just bombarding it to surrender. That's what they are trying to do, because they are not achieving their objective. So they are just resorting to other gruesome efforts. Yeah.
Okay, mic check. There we go. Pierre, let me know if that's better with my mic. Is my mic clipping?
You're fine, Tyler. I can hear you in Clubhouse anyway.
All right. Thank you. So, thank you.
Hey, there's a story in Newsweek that just came out that,
Yep.
if you don't mind on this issue, that you might want to read the first couple of lines, because it's kind of unbelievable. But the Russian military has urged Ukraine to surrender. I'll probably pronounce this wrong. Mariupol, is that correct?
Yes, Mariupol.
Okay. Amid the ongoing catastrophe gripping the eastern city. Mariupol has been among the most heavily targeted, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Citing the terrible humanitarian catastrophe, Russian forces urged Ukrainian fighters in the city to cease fighting by 10 a.m. Moscow time on Monday. All who surrender by then will be reportedly guaranteed safe passage out of the city. And this is a quote, this is from one of the this is a Russian official. A terrible humanitarian catastrophe has developed. Colonel General Mikhail Minzhets, leader of the Russian National Center for Defense Management, said on Sunday, according to The Hill. All who lay down their arms are guaranteed safe passage out of Mariupol. And the thing that bothers me about this is they're acting like some third party caused the catastrophe.
Right.
I mean, it's what an incredible amount of cognitive dissonance. I mean, who do they think's going to believe this?
Yeah.
I think the framing I use for that is that Putin and the Russian army they've been committing war crimes and violating Geneva Convention, and so that's one of the important framings with regards to there's NATO getting involved, but there's also a context for just the UN to if we start to talk about genocide, there's a certain other context to get a more of a support for the Ukrainian people down over there. So another thing that I've gathered is just the Putin's one of his very close intelligence officers. He put him under house arrest because the intelligence that Putin was relying on to initiate and to do all this, surprise, surprise, wasn't good, right? And now that all of the failures of Putin's decision making and the Russian army is starting, all the pressure from that has been building. So I mean, I think one of the stories that is starting to emerge, and you spoke to it earlier with regards to just the supply of tanks that the entire Russian army has, and the rate of destruction the Ukrainians are raining down on the Russians is just the not just the viability of the Russians over 6 months, 12 months time frame, but also just quite frankly, just the estimation for over a generation everyone has had with regards to the prowess of the Russian armed forces. And so, I mean, that's something that that does not help Putin at all.
So there's
with
another
regards to just sorry.
There's another element, which is this is potentially one of the first. At some point this was going to happen with the evolution of technology, where every person has an HD camera in their pocket, which is at some point that's going to make committing war crimes a bit tricky, a bit difficult. when there's an HD camera in every person's pocket, and we are now at that point. And that's why we're able to see in near real time. I'm watching a video right now of the shelling of Odessa from somebody in Odessa from 10 minutes ago, right? And that's why Ukraine, and by the way, a lot of the historical atrocities, which, we can point fingers at everybody. America's not immune to this by any stretch. But now that we've arrived at this point, Russia is in a difficult predicament because it's trying to, it's sort of on the wrong side of, let's call, I guess one way to frame it is the truth. And what I mean by this is, and everyone's correct in making the point that this is there's a media war element here, right? And in any scenario, and this can be in a conflict between you and your neighbor about where the local dog is shitting on your yard or their dog is shitting on your yard, or vice versa, one of you is going to be in favor of having lots of cameras everywhere to document what's happening. And one of you is going to be very upset about anybody having cameras involved. And usually the one who doesn't want any cameras anywhere is usually on the wrong side of things. And the one who's desperate to have cameras everywhere is usually on the right side of things. That's one way to measure who the good guy is and who the bad guy potentially is. That's one vector, right, to analyze, which side is in favor of, So, and in this particular environment, you have, judging from that lens, Putin seems very adamant about banning journalists and 15 years of jail time for anyone doing any kind of journalism that they don't agree with, and keeping a whole incredible amount of control on the images and video and narrative, and blocking of Twitter and media, and trying to get TikTok to curate everything that's coming into Russia. And they're even willing to dislocate from the internet generally and make their own kind of controlled internet like China sort of has. And by the way, that China's was doing this. God bless them. They understood this concept long before anybody, and they do have complete control of everything everyone sees there and everything everyone makes there, even on live streams. Anyway, So, and on the other side, Ukraine's trying to get out all of this video as much as they can. And I think that we're now at a stage where there's enough content, and that's why, because every tweet that you see about somebody saying, hey, look at all these atrocities that are happening, and inevitably somebody responds and says, yeah, just like America did in city ABC XYZ. And they have a point. That person, as annoying as that commenter is, that commenter has a point, which is this dynamic has been going on forever. But what doesn't get mentioned in that endless cycle is the realization that now it's being nearly live streamed in real time in HD by everybody. And that wasn't the case even 3 years ago. Because TikTok didn't play the role that it's now playing 3 years ago, nor did Twitter 3 years ago. It did to some degree, but to a much lesser degree, but not to the significant degree that it is happening now. And I would argue that a lot of the empathy, sympathy that people are feeling in this invasion is due to this whole dynamic of the way Ukraine is masterfully managing the media, and the way that Russia's trying to manage the media in ways that's painting itself as potentially the bad guy in this scenario because of its need to control its narratives and what have you. Anyway, I've not really seen anyone go deep into that, but I no doubt people have. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you actually take a look at Russia television, like I actually went out of my way to listen the other day to go onto their website. That's the only way that you can watch it. I have to say, some of the best propaganda I've ever seen, but it is very weirdly one-sided. It doesn't have the kind of robust global feel that some of our news media, not all of them, of course, we still have Fox News, CNN, but if you look at the landscape of our side of journalism, it's kind of somewhat balanced, whereas the state-run media is very isolated. There's a lot of like cinematic Hollywood shots, not a lot of actual reporting. Like usually you look for the texture, the kind of YouTube raw uploads that people post. There was very little of that in the Russia television stream that I watched, and I watched it for about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours, I think. So it was quite an interesting, almost like entering an alien world where I was like, wow, this doesn't even sound like our side of the story. It doesn't resemble anything like what we're seeing reported in any of the raw uploads. So if anyone is interested, you'll have to go to the Russia television website. Obviously, disclaimer, it's probably kind of skewed. But yeah, a few notes there for me on that.
I just want to blaze through a whole bunch of kind of breaking headlines from around the world related to Ukraine at the moment. One is, where is it here? Al Jazeera 6 hours ago says Biden to travel to Poland to discuss Ukraine war with the Prime Minister of Poland, because they're going to play a strategic role, being the shared border whereby which a lot of munitions will be transported. And Al Jazeera also reporting that a Ukrainian town is told to shelter after a leak at an ammonia plant. And Al Jazeera also reporting Russia and Ukraine close to an agreement in negotiations, according to Turkey. And Reuters reporting, and this is a weird one from 4 hours ago, Russia may not stop with Ukraine. NATO looks to, where is it here? NATO looks to its weakest link. It says, on board the supply ship Elba in Latvia, hours after Russian missiles first struck Ukrainian cities on February 24th, German naval commander received notice to sail 5 warships under his command to the former Soviet Republic of Latvia to help protect the most vulnerable part of NATO's eastern flank. The hasty dispatch was part of Germany's scramble to send everything that can swim out to sea As the Navy's top boss phrased it, to defend an area military strategists have long deemed the weakest point for the NATO alliance. The vessel's sudden departure demonstrated how NATO and Germany were propelled by Russian invasion into a new reality and face what officials, diplomats, and intelligence officials and security sources agree is the most serious threat to NATO's alliance collective security since the Cold War. And so apparently Latvia is, as the title implies, the weakest link within NATO. And
Tyler?
yes?
That's in the 20th century, kind of mid 20th century framing. If NATO gets involved, you're going to see a multi-foci dramatic response to the military and economic engagement here. So, I mean, there's all kinds of risks off in the seven seas, as it were. And so I just wanted to make sure that was, that's great that there's somebody who's analyzing that one specific as a front and with a 20th century lens. But there's going to be a humongous can of you-know-what if NATO gets engaged. This is not going to be just on a couple geographical spots. It's going to be really scary because there's all kinds of other things that everyone's going to see right away.
Okay.
I would like to speak to the ammonia leak. It has been reported 6 hours ago that the leak has been contained. It is in Sumi, by the way.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from BBC 3 hours ago. There's a new lineup announced for a Ukraine benefit concert with Ed Sheeran, Snow Patrol. No doubt a whole bunch of people will jump into that one. And the next one is Ukraine urges China to condemn Russia. No doubt. Yeah, Ukraine is hopeful that they can get somebody to that Russia will listen to, and that would be China. And maybe there is some hope of that, but thus far, China seems a little reluctant to strongly condemn what Russia's doing, and that in itself is an interesting thing to watch. That one, because the U.S. could play that card in a way, knowing that China's reluctant or refusing to condemn Russia's activities, could tarnish China's reputation. And if America knows that, America could, what's the word I'm looking for? Capitalize on that fact to cause additional headache for China if it refuses to do that, right? I think that point is self-evident. I don't need to belabor that point, but it's just an advantage. China, if America knows that, and America is realizing that, then America is going to take advantage of that. It's free points on the chessboard. It's kind of like a free pawn in the chess exchange, or you could develop into more. So, other Ukraine headlines: TikTok algorithm directs users to fake news about Ukraine war. Study says a new TikTok account can be shown falsehoods about Ukraine war within minutes after signing up on the app. Oh, wow. Now, by the way, this article's only 27 minutes old from The Guardian, so it just published minutes ago on The Guardian. And the point of the article is that and journalists are doing this lately as a way to test the algorithms of social media apps like TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, where you create a brand new quote unquote virgin account and look to see what kind of content the app is recommending to you as a virgin account, right? You see where I'm going? So they've been doing quite a lot of this in recent months and in this case, they want to know, with regard to Russia and Ukraine, if you're a brand new TikTok virgin account, what are you more likely to see? Pro-Ukraine perspectives or pro-Russian perspectives? And according to this article, scrolling the For You pages, that's like TikTok has a section called For You, where they recommend stuff. That's their algorithm. And For You exposes users to disinformation within 40 minutes. is the point of this article. A new TikTok account can be shown falsehoods about Ukraine war within minutes of signing up on the app, according to an investigation by anti-misinformation outlet called NewsGuard. The company, which monitors the trustworthiness of news outlets across the web, ran a pair of tests to assess how the video sharing app TikTok treated information about the conflict. It found that a new account that did nothing but scroll the app's algorithmically curated For You page, watching videos about the war, would be funneled towards false and misleading content within 40 minutes. Quote, towards the end of our 45-minute experiment, analysts' feeds were almost exclusively populated with both accurate and false content related to the war in Ukraine, with no distinction made between disinformation and reliable sources. Quote, at a time when false narratives about the Russia-Ukraine conflict are proliferating online, none of the videos fed to our analysts by TikTok's algorithms contained any information about the trustworthiness of the sources, warnings, fact checks, or additional information that could empower users to reliable information. But that might not be very surprising to regular tech newsers. It might be surprising to non-tech newsers, but we've been rather consistently seeing TikTok is how should I phrase this, friends, to people who might be new to tech news? Basically, TikTok seems to have a rather strong reputation, a consistent history of doing what the CCP would like, that China happens to have quite a good control of TikTok's algorithms and what people are exposed to in TikTok. So we've seen lots of articles over many, many months that TikTok is itself kind of weaponized form of, and that its algorithm is a very keen interest to China's government, the CCP, and that they use that app in very interesting ways. By the way, Russia claims, and I don't think it's necessarily totally wrong, that YouTube and Twitter and Facebook are weaponized by America, and that's why they've banned those apps in Russia, because they don't want that content coming into Russia. And I think it is very interesting, this study that they are doing here in TikTok. To me, this is very interesting to know. Is TikTok algorithm going to generally be highlighting pro-Ukraine or anti-Ukraine or what have you? And because Twitter, as an example, is very proactive in kind of shutting down pro-Russian narratives, or even deleting tweets from Russian ambassadors or the London embassy in Russia, as an example. So, yeah, different platforms are going to take different perspectives on this, and it's interesting. Somebody did an analysis of the TikTok algorithm. Somebody have a point there?
Tyler, we were talking when the Facebook papers were coming out. We were talking about just the algorithm, right? And just how influential it is and things like that. But now, turning the page into a context of war, they are, just as you said, weaponized. It is literally psyops. These are psyops weapons. Kind of period, right? So,
well, that's the weird bit. Is I think the general population still is under the perspective that TikTok is perhaps neutral, and I think collectively we've seen a rather alarming amount of evidence that it's not, that it very clearly has an agenda, and that for whatever reason the U.S. Policymakers have been surprisingly deaf to the rather strong evidence that we consistently have seen over the many months. And
Valerie, have you been trying to speak?
Yes, somebody's trying to speak, but we can't hear them. Who is that?
It was me, Tyler. I don't know if can you hear me now?
No. Oh, is that Valerie?
Yeah, it's in the Twitter space.
Oh, go ahead, Valerie.
I think she has been trying to speak. I think your mic may be muted.
Yeah, but her voice in Clubhouse is very weak.
Valerie, hold on, everybody. Valerie, are you trying to speak from Twitter Space? If so, please count to 10 so I can fix your mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
1,
There you go.
Two,
Thank you.
three, four.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And I know I got a couple of things that are a little behind the conversation, but one I thought was worthwhile was on Friday. The UN, let's say the Russian ambassador to the UN was interviewed. Of course, he was towing the Federation line as far as information. But his last phrase before he turned away and walked away from the microphone was that whoever wins the information war wins the war. So I thought that was pretty telling.
Well, that speaks to my previous point 10 minutes ago, that it's interesting to see what that means from a Western perspective or a Russian perspective, because the Kremlin is certainly trying to control the information and understands that dynamic very importantly. And that's one side takes a very controlling approach, and the other side, well, let's be honest, both sides have invested a lot in what narratives come out and different approaches, but I think it's worth analyzing the strategies of each side. And one side inherently is going to be obsessed with controlling and minimizing, and the other side is going to be, as with any conflict, the side who believes that they are in the right, honestly, is going to be much more willing to be more transparent about letting journalists in all the time. Ukraine would love journalists to come over endlessly, but by the way, right? I mean, where Russia's going to have 15-year prison sentences for journalists, Ukraine would love nothing more than for every journalist on the planet to bring a camera over to Ukraine at the moment, if they would risk their lives to do so. So that in itself is rather telling. So other Ukraine topics to cover before we go into the big tech headlines of the day? No? Going
Tyler,
on?
I have one question though. Should we be tweeting to tech news also Ukrainian headlines, or just continue to do the tech headlines? Because I'm just looking at something that just came through on Ukraine, and I'm saying, because I just don't know what protocol you want to use for this.
You can do Ukraine headlines, sir.
Okay.
By the way, there's one point I wanted to share while we're kind of transitioning between Ukraine and tech, is that on my team, I'm back. Hello from Stockholm, by the way. I'm happy to be back. I just arrived today. And I have my events that I've been doing here, and this is the 10th year anniversary event we're doing on Wednesday. One of my core team members of many years, I think about 8 years, is Tatiana, who is Ukrainian here in Stockholm. And she's perhaps, I don't like to pick favorites among team members, but she's amazing. And she's over the years continued to rise to the top of, my little team. And Tatiana is amazing. And she's Ukrainian. And so we have this event on Wednesday, and her and I were just having an exchange. I said, hey, Tatiana, do you want to jump on stage Wednesday night in any kind of capacity? And she says, yes, I do, because I'm building a job board for Ukrainians who want to, and to build a bridge between the Swedish tech ecosystem and the Ukrainians, either for relocation or for remote work or anything like that. And I think that's brilliant. And I think it speaks to what I think is fantastic. And the point I want to make is, I believe if Ukraine is able to survive this invasion, that it has an incredibly bright future in terms of its newfound reputation, and that a lot of the companies that have left Russia and a whole lot of people would be interested in investing in Ukraine, hiring Ukrainians, doing outsourcing to Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the perceived stock of Ukraine is going to be much, much higher. It previously didn't exist. I mean, generally, Ukraine was very low in people's radars. That's obviously no longer the case. And there could be an economic boom. And there could be a really, that if there is a silver lining in all this, it's that if Ukraine manages to end this, in any kind of meaningful way, that the recovery might be very rapid, and they could very soon surpass economically, and in many ways, where they were previously, and they could truly have a post-invasion boom. And I pray to God they do. Nothing would be cooler than that, right? So I love what my friend Tatiana is doing to play whatever, her role in that. I think that's very fantastic. And by the way, in all fairness, I think it's also true that there's an incredible amount of world-class talent leaving or looking to leave Russia. Truly top of the stack talent from Russia, of all types of disciplines, all sciences and maths, and especially computer and tech and everywhere, that probably are very interested to pursue outside of Russia. And that's where things get a little tricky, especially in places like where I am in Stockholm, where you could see potentially Russians wanting to leave Russia and be kind of Russian, like a bit of a diaspora. We call it a brain drain, of course, but that is sort of an opportunity for countries and companies who are open to pursuing that. And I hope, I really hope for the best for everybody involved in both of those scenarios, both Ukraine and Russia.
Tyler,
Yeah.
quick thing. You probably want to introduce her to the CEO of Luxoft, because they just pulled a bunch of people out of Russia, as well as they're helping everybody they have from Ukraine diversify. Like, we literally had 4 dozen people from Ukraine that we split up in 2 different offices that we have between Poland and the Czech Republic. So that might be something, because he
That's awesome.
posted on LinkedIn that he was pulling, every one of them out of Russia, and the ones in Russia that wanted to leave, he's also helping those too. So you may want to hook her up with that. If you need help, let me know.
There is only one issue there. Like, at least in Canada, when you're a refugee, as would be the legal status of these people, there are restrictions on how much you can work. So, if there was like a unified framework, I think globally, to say, hey, we're going to accept these refugees, but allow them to work, because I think a lot of processing that trauma comes later. But right now, I think people want to be distracted and move away from that problem. It's not necessarily the case that people just want to sit around for a year and think about this while they're not allowed to work. So that's the only criticism that I have of the current refugee system, at least from the Canadian perspective. There may be other affordances in the European Union.
But if
Well,
they are
in the
talented, they can easily
United
convert
States,
it to a work visa, right? It's not a big deal.
a lot of the people in Russia that I know already have jobs. They're coming out. Like, I have friends who have companies in Russia who have basically relocated their teams into Armenia.
Yeah, even in Canada, actually, that if they accept you as a refugee, you get in as a landed immigrant, which allows you to work. I mean, it's kind of restrictive in terms of working in sensitive areas like, government office and things like that, in parliament or stuff. But in general, you could. I was sponsored by Canadian government, and I was in a refugee camp, and I was able to work immediately. Except those sensitive areas until I became a citizen. So I think they do have a dichotomy as long as they accept them before they enter the country, and they say how they can enter Canada.
Okay.
This is I think you Tyler, you on something here. Um, the history shows us that after a big war, you see Japan as well as South Korea and Vietnam, there's a period of economic boom and investment. I think you are actually on something, and I appreciate it. To learn more. But I think the opportunity are there. A lot of talents are there from Russia across the border. We've seen that increase in folks that want to come here in to US from Russia. And I think even better for US too. So I think we're going to
Right.
be that. So thank you.
Yeah, that's my point, is to be open-minded about, there's a lot of Russians who are not fans of the government, just like there's a lot of Chinese who are not fans of the government, but it's not exactly easy for them to leave necessarily, or, but Israel as well. America. I mean, I'm not. This is not a naming and shaming contest at all. The point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of people who you wouldn't necessarily suspect are, you know, good, awesome, brilliant contributions to, who for whom politics, it doesn't run their life and their world, and they're hyper talented, and these hyper talented individuals are everywhere, and their talent is what they are about more than their politics, and this is a huge opportunity for those who can put talent and passion above politics. So I hope countries like America can keep an open mind, and the countries that do have an open mind about that, I think, will benefit.
I did in 2016. I did some research with Syrian refugees, and they wanted to integrate into the work place market immediately and combine it with learning languages. That was immediately. And actually Ukrainians, we have Ukrainians at our university as students. So I imagine that the level of expertise is even higher than we had it with the Syrians. And actually a lot of people underestimated how much abilities the Syrians had when they had to flee Syria.
In fact, the Canadians actually have, the what is it, the pension that we have been talking about. So the biggest population is becoming, the baby boomers are retiring, so they have that problem how to pay for it. So in fact, they used to have this automatic immigration through the skilled workers system in the Canadian citizenship and immigration website. Even anybody can go there and get point system they have, so that you get point if you speak French, for example, because Canada has French Canada, or if you have a relative that you would have an easy time assimilating into society in Canada. So they would at that point, and it used to be 85 point that you would get this immigration, and then there is a paper, but you would go to Canada as landed immigrant, and then they would have a process to be a citizen. But now they even dropped it to 67 because they are really trying to get skilled labor where they can get into the country and immediately start working, so that they would contribute into the social security saving system that can pay for the older generation. So that's why I think Canada would be even more open taking into these types of skilled population. And the last one I would add into that is, even this morning I was reading that the Russian tech professionals are leaving the country in big numbers. So I think a lot of countries that have this kind of pension problems will take advantage of it. I'm pretty sure, like Germany did during the Syria immigration crisis. I'm done speaking.
One last point I want to touch on before we move on to the big tech stories is, because we haven't spent much time on it, but plenty of outlets have covered the point, and it's one of the most important, which is the rising kind of food costs related to the fact that Ukraine is going into the beginnings of spring. It's, by the way, happy Nowruz to all of our Persian friends, which is the first day of spring. It's kind of like the
Aw, thanks, Tyler.
the Persian New Year, which, by the way, I have to say, there's a lot of cool holidays around the world. And today in Stockholm, it was a glorious, beautiful, sunny day, and it feels like the first day of spring. And to me, it just makes all the sense in the world that you would celebrate your new year as the spring equinox, where the days are now, doesn't that make sense that would be the beginning of the calendar year, is the beginning of spring? The way that the Persians do, I think, is brilliant, that they do that. And it's a beautiful celebration that they have. It's a big feast. And for people,
signifying new beginnings, new birth of flowers and nature, and all good things, all the new potentials and possibilities for the year, starting with the first bloom.
Yeah. So
And sakura in Japan is starting to bloom, and 1 week or 2 time you'll be full bloom.
yeah, but I want back on the point is that the farmers in Ukraine this is also when they should start planting their massive harvest, which, by the way, feeds a significant percentage of people throughout the developing world in the West. One of the major food baskets regions, especially for the West and the developing world, which they're a little preoccupied there in Ukraine. Farming isn't high on their priority. Well, it is high on their priority list, although they've got this year some other higher priorities, as you can imagine, and that could have very catastrophic effects for the world generally, because if Ukraine isn't able to have its traditional harvest in the fall as it normally does, food prices will skyrocket, and they already are skyrocketing. And that in Western Europe and in America and Scandinavia is a major inconvenience. But in the developing world, the difference of doubling the price of wheat to an American, as I said, is a major inconvenience. In the developing world, it's catastrophic. It means famine is what that means. And there's estimates as high as 1 billion people will likely be suffer kind of famine-like conditions as a result of this conflict, not allowing the traditional harvest to happen. And that's very troubling. And what it would require is that this conflict end immediately, so that the farming can go on, as it normally does. But that doesn't look very likely at the moment, and that means that we could start to see a massive downward sort of spiral that might be difficult to pull out of. And so yet again, I remind you, as I do on a nearly daily basis, to take control of your water and your food and your energy more than ever. And I've been yelling, you guys know who join us daily. That's a daily reminder, and that reminder is becoming, I think, more tactile and significant and obvious today than perhaps previously. And it will continue to do so.
I
think Zelensky made a video to encourage the farmers to continue to do farming, right? So that they don't run into food shortages.
They don't really have
He actually made a video 1 or 2 weeks ago.
Well, also, Cheryl, the fact that Russian shelling of Odessa has just started, if Russia takes over Odessa, it won't matter if they farm, because they'll have no option to export it. It'll be very difficult to export. So, shall we get into the big...
Do you want to make 2 points?
Go ahead, Mabwana.
Mabwana here. Yeah, so I was obviously in Africa. We're wondering about this quite a bit, and I saw on just on Twitter people mention.
Sorry, we lost you. Mabwana?
Yeah, Mabana, we can't hear you. He muted.
Yeah. Mabwana, you're muted. Hopefully we can circle back.
No, I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we do. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was saying that the climate aspect is to have a strong sort of agricultural body that regulated prices and encouraged farmers to grow wheat. But when they deregulated it and became more global, it meant that imports dependency became very, very high for South Africa, and the rest of Africa, I think, is a similar story. But it might actually start countries to think about bringing back those agricultural boards to encourage farmers to grow things like wheat that are strategic. My other point I wanted to make actually is related to, I think you're talking about the talent leaving Ukraine and Russia. I don't know if you're aware, Tyler, but Biology's got a new book coming out on the 4th of July, The Network State, which is about countries being formed virtually first, then land second. I wonder if we might see this as my own prediction, that maybe a bunch of Russians and Ukrainians who are like-minded in the tech industry or, band together, maybe someone gives them a bit of land somewhere and they start a country. That's something that is interesting to think about and watch in the coming months or even years.
Yeah, I mean, well, you're right. Balaji, this is one of his bigger and more interesting concepts. The idea that you could have a sort of country of the future that's no longer geographically based. And he gives an example that you could think of, like Google employees are all over the world, and they have little kind of embassies in the form of Google campuses. Again, this is an example where in the future, you could think of geeks, or you're going to have tribes that become of different stripes enabled by technology, and particularly they could even have their own currencies via Web3 and decentralized finance and etc. And then eventually they might grow in significance and power to the point where they might even make their own geographies in the forms of buying an island from Myanmar or Thailand, or somewhere that has a whole lot of extra islands. Make their own new modern crypto Monaco, for example, or seasteading. It gets very, very interesting, and he does have a whole new book coming out about that. And it's a really, really, really interesting concept, and he makes some really, really interesting points in talks that he's giving leading up to this book, which is why he's writing the book, and it is coming out in the next few days, so keep an eye out for that.
What's the name of that author?
The Network State. Balaji wrote it. I mean, I think he started off as a series of posts. I think it's interesting because also you're seeing some governments, Tanzania, for instance, is trying to create, kind of the next, the Silicon Beach, or whatever you want to call it, island, of Zanzibar, by, making it a digital nomad paradise. The next step would be to maybe accept talent to come in. Maybe it's Ukrainians and crypto, Ukrainians and Russians are in the crypto Web3 minded, and maybe give them an island or a bit of land and create the next sort of export free zone or something like that. So it's a really interesting idea.
That's awesome. That's like a decentralized country.
Right. That's sort of his point. That's well said. A decentralized country. That's a very apt, pithy explanation. Okay, so the biggest tech headline for today. Shall we get into that? And before we do, of course, we need to. Tradition requires that we use the air horn. There we go. So these are your biggest headlines for Monday, March 21st. The first is that about Apple's Studio Display. Who gives a shit? Is that honestly the biggest story today? Come on. This is the new Apple display that was announced about 2-3 weeks ago. That goes along with the new Apple Studio.
It does have a microprocessor in it, right? So that's kind of weird.
Yeah, I think the difference is it runs OS 15. So it's basically a giant iPad without the touch facility.
And it has 64 gigabytes of onboard storage and uses only 2 gigabytes. The storage might be related to Apple's A13 Bionic chip. So somebody found that out in the hardware, and geeks are getting excited about that. Okay, next biggest one is from Financial Times. It says, as EU lawmakers finalize the Digital Markets Act, big U.S. tech companies have failed to lobby for substantial changes and are now focused on compliance. Brussels is set to finalize stringent new legislation targeting Silicon Valley giants whose desperate lobbying has fallen on deaf ears. Yeah, because they're not able to play the same lobbying games in the EU that they are accustomed to doing in the US. And this has been a long time in the making. And this start Tyler's regular rant here, where I mentioned that I've been lunching with EU lawmakers for a decade now. And without fail, every single one of those lunches ends in coffee and dessert, where they, after letting their guard down, reveal that they're eager to create an environment that makes it challenging for the big American tech giants to squash the local incumbent Europeans. where they constantly lament about why there isn't a European Google or Facebook or Amazon or Apple or what have you, and we need to create the legislative environment and regulatory environment that would create an opportunity to foster a European tech giant. And that day is finally here. They're calling it the Digital Markets Act. And they're going to make it harder for those American companies to have their sort of unfair advantage as they used to have. And the GDPR was the step one of that, and this is a much bigger continuation of that. So here it is, and they weren't able to stop it because that was the point. The whole point was that they wouldn't be able to stop it, and you're not going to stop it. And Margaret Vestager from Denmark, who's kind of the leading, if you had to pick a poster child for the EU in leading that, it's certainly Margaret. And big tech has known, here it is. So it is what it is. The next one is a company called Ramp, which helps companies automate expense reporting, raises $200 million and $500 million in debt at an $8.1 billion valuation led by Founders Fund. Okay. FTX launches a crypto exchange services in Australia, including crypto derivatives. Okay. And they're going to have a Sydney-based officer. Okay. Next is from Financial Times. The CEO of a lithography machine maker ASML says, and that's a very important company, which we'll explain in a minute, out of the Netherlands. They say chip makers' expansion plans will be constrained by a shortage of its critical equipment over the next 2 years. And that's a great point right there, which is chip makers like Intel and TSMC and these very, very important, huge chip making companies have invested. New governments are now realizing the importance of chip companies in a very, very, very big way. And they're investing billions and billions and billions and billions and billions into Intel and TSMC and all of the big chip companies. And the countries who have these big chip companies, like the UK with ARM, or the US with Intel, or Taiwan with TSMC, or what have you, they now understand that they have incredibly important companies in these big chip makers, and they want to double down and triple down on those big companies and decouple from China to whatever degree and kind of leave China out of that game. And China is trying to invest heavily and get the intellectual property by any means necessary to build up their own chips, and they're having a very hard time doing that. And the point of this article is all of those companies, those big chip fab companies, are dependent on this very interesting little Dutch company, although it's not little at all. But it's, this company in the Netherlands, it goes by the name ASML, which most people are totally unaware of, which all those chip companies are dependent on. And the CEO of ASML out of the Netherlands says that those big chip makers' expansion plans, with all the tens of billions of dollars that they have to build all these new factories, will be constrained by a shortage of ASML's critical equipment, because ASML itself has critical equipment constraints. And so if ASML, those big chip companies will only be able to grow in correlation with the ability of ASML's ability to grow, because they are a bottleneck constraint to those chip makers' growth. And that's a very good point. So you can have all those billions of dollars, lined up to grow, but you're only going to be able to do so as much as ASML is able to supply you. So next is from Bloomberg. It's a profile on Mr. Yuri Milner, the wealthy Russian who invested early in Twitter and Facebook through DST Global. And Yuri Milner is now carefully distancing himself from Kremlin connections. Makes sense. Starting in the 2010s, they talk about Yuri and when he showed up with bags full of cash in the Silicon Valley game and was splishy splashing everybody with a whole bunch of cash. And now that's kind of come back to be an interesting topic of dinner party conversations around Silicon Valley, as to where is Yuri Milner's allegiances lie. And so the Bloomberg's doing a story about him. And the next one is that Apple has removed the option to buy and rent movies from the Apple TV app on Android TV and Google TV. Users can still access their iTunes library. Next, Goldman Sachs says it is the first major U.S. bank to trade an over-the-counter crypto transaction in partnership with crypto merchant called Galaxy Digital. And Ukrainian tech startups are now mapping escape routes for refugees, finding them rides, shelter, and food, and paying workers to fight with the army. The tech leaders with operations in Ukraine are mapping escape routes and paying workers to fight with the army. Our plan is winning this war, is the article from the Wall Street Journal. And the New York Times article says Brazil's Supreme Court reverses its decision to ban Telegram, which it had ordered on Friday after Telegram suddenly worked to comply with the court's orders. Brazil's Supreme Court blocked Telegram on Friday. The messaging app then responded with measures to fight misinformation, and the court quickly lifted its ban. There you go. So Telegram's able to comply with governments, like all big apps do when they get, when kind of money starts leading the train. Next is an article about Substack. Who cares? And any other really big, interesting ones? Not really. Nope. No. Okay, so those are the big, boring headlines for today, and then we get into the tweets. Anyone have a tweet of any kind that they found since we met last time that they would like to make sure we dive into?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna be biased again. An African agri-tech actually raised 40 million Kenyan based, and they do actually amazing things because the African population is still like 70%, still depends on agriculture. So what they do is they provide inputs, financing, and many other things. So now they are trying to expand beyond Kenya, and they just raised 40 million. So there you go. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you for that. I've got a whole bunch of good tweets here, as we always do. I can pick some at random. Anyone else got one they want to share before we go into the tweets?
So, Tyler, one quick one. This
Yeah.
is my world, the whole security world. So, open source, they basically backdoored it to wipe out Russian computers. I don't know if you got to that. It came out midday Friday.
No.
Yeah, so from an open source perspective, some of the code contributors put a couple of backdoors in it to essentially wipe out Russian computers. And Washington Post posted something on this about 4 hours ago. It says Ukraine hacktivism fights and threatens open source software, so much so that the FBI and CISA warned about this.
So can you help paint in more detail what's going on here?
Okay, so they contributed to a platform called Node IPC. And what happens is if you've used this, right, so if you remember last week, they announced that the Russians have been using this. They built out this platform. Here's the open source frameworks that they use. Well, somebody felt the need to go in and modify one of those open source packages and add two pieces to it that would now, if Russian software is used, we can go in and we can wipe out their computers. And from my side,
when you say their computers, you mean importantly all their computers who have touched this.
Right. So if it looks like it's in Russia, you can wipe it out. If somebody else figures it out, they can use it against Russia. Russia can use it against their adversaries too, because it's an open source stuff, and pretty much 84% of all applications are written with open source.
Holy crap!
So this could be a sort of I think a nuclear cyber attack, a cyber attack of nuclear proportions.
But
Log4j all over again.
Tom, let me ask you this, because there's two ways to look at this. One is just the deployment of that specific open source technology in Russia and their risk to it, but the strategy of using open source software projects and the risk of that with bad actors, with malactors, what kind of risk that exposes just open source projects generally to as well, I would think is something that's a little bit of a head scratcher.
Correct. It creates less trust in open source software. But most of the practitioners now started looking at open source software as potential insider risk. So, and the bad part is you can't there's no tools out there to detect backdoors in code. Everything that tests security vulnerabilities, nothing to detect backdoors. That requires a lot of human intervention, and minimal cost is $100,000 per release. And then also with that, there's news on a TransUnion hack. I don't know if you have that one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so apparently TransUnion's latest hack was based on poor password hygiene. If you want, I can DM you the two of them.
Okay.
Yeah, Tom, to jump in on both of those, because they both were out in the news again this morning. So the TransUnion is their TransUnion Africa, I think, division. They apparently was faulty weak password, that the user's password was password. So and they say they're not going to pay the ransomware there. And then the open source one is basically someone who is against Russia putting vulnerabilities into the open source. And as you note, the open source community, most software is above, as you said, 84% open source. And so the open source community, it polices itself. And so as Tom, as you've talked about before, there's been things that have gone wrong on GitHub, et cetera. And people use this open source. And that's why the software bill of materials that everyone has is so important, or an important factor, that so you can go when something is released as a vulnerable or it has malware in it, you can go back and see if it's in your code and where. And so this one, though, it sounds to me a lot more like Log4j or something that's actually going to go, because the person, the hacktivist there that put that in that open source code, it's against Russia, but they're not going to be the only ones using it, as you noted, right? So this has the ability to, again, bleed out anywhere that there's internet, same as NotPetya did in 2017, 2016. So again, this just shows that the cyber, once we start getting into cyber, which we are doing, we're in cyber espionage with all of these different countries, with each other, that this has the potential to bleed out of its intended target. And we, I was listening to the news last night. One of the reasons we're not more offensive with Russia is we're still uncertain of each other's capabilities, and it will be like a nuclear attack. Once we start doing that, it's mutual assured destruction if we start really escalating in the offensive area, because we do have capabilities in each other's infrastructures or
This
malware.
this is
Yeah.
going to raise the issue of the international governance of all open source projects very, very immediately.
Well, or in international governance of cyber, just of cyber war. So there are, a lot of proponents talking about, quote, Geneva conventions and diplomacy, et cetera, because that's where we are. I mean, as noted, there's still these hacktivists who are acting on their own behest or allegedly, supporting their nations. You've got just private entities, Ponti and those guys doing all of this stuff, even though they're, coming from Russia or coming from Iran with, nods of their governments. It's really hard to attribute to the right entities, but also to monitor this. It's a diplomacy factor. We can't go down on those people because they're in Russia. So, our U.S. it's
Yeah,
done through diplomacy, as you note.
I didn't articulate my point well enough. What I'm saying is that the open source communities that have international contributors and incoming call, and the governance by which they choose to admit or remove a contributor as a valid contributor on an international scale is going to assume a real sense of urgency, because to the extent that there are Russian um, sympathizers who contribute to open source code, this whole phenomenon almost um, resembles the mutually assured destruction construct. So that purging of Russian contributors to open source is probably going to be happening fairly quickly.
Senator Warner, a few weeks ago, I just heard about it for the first time, but as I understand it, this has been kind of bouncing around D.C. with regards to how here in the States, the Congress is kind of, senators and Congress are starting to think about how to frame how a cyber engagement or an attack will be a closed loop tied back into a military, a declaration of war. And I think some of the use cases that he had mentioned when he was interviewed one of those Sundays on a show was just loss of life. So attacks that materialize in a loss of life they're starting to look at that as being considered as acts of war.
No, David, I think they gave, to your point, I think they gave several, they haven't given the definitive list, but they have given several examples, and that it's loss of life. I think there's attacks on critical infrastructure. We've talked about that months ago in this room, such as power grids and food supply, and it's just when they escalate to a certain level. But try and look that up so we can discuss it tomorrow. But when cyber, absolutely, people are like, when does cyber become an act of war? And I'm like, when it impacts us, akin to analogous to an attack, a cyber kinetic attack. And then to John's point, knowing who's in these open source communities, because we are global in this in this day and age, we're global. So a lot of open source communities have global participants, and they are self policed. So a lot of communities, and you've got a lot of developers absolutely coming out of Ukraine and Russia. And I think it was early on with the sanctions that companies were required to pull developers that are Russian or have those Russian connections. The sanctions again are very complex, both as to goods and people that you can deal with. But yeah.
Okay. The next article I have from Ken from the Wall Street Journal, that chip sanctions challenge Russia's tech ambitions. Losing access to some top-end chips from Asia over the invasion of Ukraine undercuts Russia's efforts to develop advanced weaponry, AI, and robotics. There you go. Brilliant point. Next is from Evan, that Ukraine is running ads on the interwebs for volunteer forces. It says, join the International Legion. Volunteers from any country can join the resistance against Russian occupiers. It's an ad. It's like a Twitter ad and a Facebook ad or an Instagram ad. Apply now. Join the International Legion to come to Ukraine and fight the Russians. Volunteers from any country can now join the resistance against Russian occupiers. And it's a online ad.
Do you get paid, or what's obviously besides the fighting resistance? What do you get? I mean, is it kind of a pay? Is it a
you
pay?
get
Like
an
I'm very
NFT.
curious.
You get an NFT of the Ukrainian flag. No, I'm joking. But
Oh my God.
yeah,
Is that real? Or is that a joke
Meta.
answer?
you get virtual Ukrainian land in the metaverse. I jest, but it's a really interesting concept. By the way, the Mexican restaurant that I frequent, in the bathroom above the toilet, has an old join the Mexican Revolution, fight with Pancho Villa, and a very similar ad that was paper based at the time and wheat posted all over Mexico and southern, what is now Texas and California and Arizona, to join Pancho Villa to fight in the Mexican Revolution against the Spanish. And at a similar point, this was back in the day, part of how wars were fought. But I love that we have this modern version of it, which is far more targeted, because you could specifically target people who have fought in the U.S. military. And this ad could be, no doubt, via Facebook or Twitter. You could target people who have fought in the U.S. military. And I wonder if Facebook is giving them free ad space, or if Twitter is giving them free ad space to do exactly this. That, if you're a journalist, would be really worth investigating. That would be super fucking interesting. If Twitter is...
I do think there is. I think there is one element to caution here, though. So, for example, in Canada, some people went to go fight for um, the Taliban and then came back here and were prosecuted. So it may really well depend on the political climate of your country, on how they see participation in such a conflict, because it may cost you your liberty when you come back.
But imagine, by the way, this is totally possible because it's been revealed that Twitter, but not surprisingly at all, is kind of behind the scenes, in favor of Ukraine in this whole issue. Twitter absolutely could be providing Ukraine an ad budget. By the way, Twitter provides me an ad budget for free for tech news around the world. So I don't think it's at all unreasonable to think they might be giving Ukraine an ad budget and Ukraine might be using that ad budget precisely in the ad that I just retweeted to the Tech News Twitter account of the ad that I just described that says join the International Legion. Matter of fact, I'll bet money that they are doing exactly that. And that's interesting because essentially Twitter is subsidizing or helping Ukraine to recruit talent through Twitter to fight on behalf of Ukraine against Russia. That's just what an interesting scenario that is. But the question is Twitter doing that? I'll bet money they are. As I said, my evidence is they're giving me free ad dollars to promote tech news around the world. So what can I say? If you're a journalist and you could get evidence of that, although that might be a little difficult to do, but not at all possible if you're an investigative journalist worth your salt, you could probably crack that case wide open. And by the way, Twitter might not be so worried about that getting out. They might actually be kind of okay with that getting out, but interesting, really interesting. And regardless, the whole point that Ukraine's using social media to advertise for people to join them is itself very interesting. Next one is from Evan. It says, meet Chipotle, the Mexican, speaking of Mexican restaurants, what a coincidence. America's worst Mexican restaurant, Chipotle, is testing a robotic chef to make tortilla chips. So you can add Mexican franchise restaurants, tortilla chip makers, to the ever-growing list of people who are now on the replacement list due to automation with the new Chipotle's new robot chef. Thank you for that one, Evan. And the next is from Professor Osif from CNN, that Joe Biden and the Biden administration formally determines Myanmar's military committed genocide against its people. And they did. And I want to applaud the Biden administration for formally recognizing that. The Biden administration has formally determined that the Myanmar military committed genocide and crimes against humanity against the Rohingya and its own people, and good that they formally recognize that. The next is from Thomas Tong, that the FBI is now saying that there's a new ransomware which is targeting U.S. critical infrastructure. Oh, gee, what a surprise. The FBI warns of a new ransomware called Avoslocker being used in attacks targeting multiple U.S. critical infrastructure sectors. Gee, wow, what a shock. I'm so surprised. As was predicted even before Russia put its troops on the Ukraine border. I said if we get into a big conflict, you can rest assured one of the big moves is going to be cyber attacks on critical infrastructure as a prelude. The next is from Thomas Tong, that there's a new supersonic jet that will fly from the U.S. to China in just 1 hour. A company has announced it is constructing a new supersonic jet that is capable of flying from U.S. to China in 1 hour, and you can take a look at that crazy jet that I just tweeted at the Tech News Twitter account. And the next one is from BB. I love this one. DJI, the big drone maker, has newest drone, can fly in heavy rain, and it has its own robotic dock, which is very interesting. It's called the DJI Matrix 30 Enterprise. It's not a hobby drone. It folds down small for an enterprise drone, and the significance of having its own robotic dock is that now it could be used as a perimeter surveillance device, so that if it knows where it's landing and taking off and recharging, it could. By the way, I own a DJI drone, and anyone who owns a DJI drone knows that if you're flying a DJI drone and you're letting it fly away from you, it very intelligently knows that it's gone too far and must return and charge it and land so that it doesn't fall out of the sky. So as soon as you've gone too far, it says, I must return home now. And it takes the controls away from you the idiot who's flying it too far, and it just turns around and flies back to wherever you took off from, the takeoff point, and it self lands wherever it took off. That's great. Now, what if it lands onto a charger? You see where this is going. So it flies, it comes back, and it lands right back on its charger. You see the genius here? Now you leave it on your roof or anywhere around your residence, and now this thing could take off based on a motion sensor. If some thief enters your property or jumps over one of your gates, this thing launches into the air, records everything, and then can land, 20 minutes later, because these batteries in these drones don't last that long, normally about 20 minutes. And then it could land after 20 minutes and recharge itself and be ready to take off again. That's why that's so incredibly cool.
That would be
And
awesome. Put that
maybe
into a.
so I just say maybe in the future like you can relate all those charges as well, so you can expand the range of these drones as well.
Right, that as well. The next is from Tina. She found a cool one that David Beckham has handed
Hey,
over.
Tyler.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I couldn't get off mute fast enough. I was actually working with a drone fleet manager about 5 or 6 years ago, and with Verizon to try and establish charging stations that were weather protected and continuously powered, associated with cell towers, as part of a medical drone project. They backed out because of funding issues, but I think it's inevitable that we will see um, continuous power supplied, weatherproof drone charging stations so that drones can be managed pretty much autonomously through the full cycle of delivery for numerous use cases. So I think that's inevitable.
Indeed, it is. Yeah, the next is from Tina that David Beckham hands over his Instagram account of 71 million followers to a doctor in Ukraine, allowing her to live broadcast a day in her life where she is helping mothers give birth safely. He encourages more celebrities to do the same, and I just want to applaud that headline. That's incredibly cool. And indeed, celebrities who have incredible reach should indeed be sharing the mic with other worthwhile people like that. That's kind of a brilliant use case of social media, I must say. Kudos to David Beckham for doing that. The next is from BB, from Bloomberg, that Bored Ape, which is one of the wildly successful NFT series, now has a spin-off venture, which has venture gone sour, sparks legal fight, split among cake apes, and ownership. What is this about? Lawsuits are flying over neon-colored digital depictions of monkeys covered with cake frosting and candles. The latest legal battle to hit the world of NFTs. Oh, so these are like doctored Bored Apes, essentially, and that's causing headaches for the whole Bored Ape NFT. It's a spin-off of the original Bored Apes, and this was inevitable, and it's going to continue to be inevitable, which is minor art. There's a gray area between what is the original and what is an appropriate adaptation of the original. And this happens in music all the time, where you have the original song by the blues by Robert Johnson, some 12-bar blues songs, and then you have Led Zeppelin doing a variation of Robert Johnson's 12-bar blues. And the question is, how much do you need to change from the original to make a new, uniquely new creation?
Right, Tyler. That
Hey,
comes up in
Tyler.
music. Is it transformative? How much of it are they using? Which one of the defenses to copyright are they using? Music, as you notice, its own unique beast. Bored apes give the bored ape holders the right to make derivatives. So you're allowed to make a derivative of your ape or give that right to somebody else. There's approved derivatives. So that's but it sounds like this is a whole side project, and bored apes, as they gain more and more notoriety, I think that they're beating CryptoPunks right now. But anyways, yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what rights they didn't have and what that is, because I know that they do give the owner's IP ownership to create derivatives. So this might be a separate organization that's copying them or something.
Mm-hmm. The
So
next,
Tyler, you mentioned that it is popular, but why is it popular?
I don't want to get into that right now. That's a whole other conversation.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
The
really quickly, there's a podcast that goes over it all. If you look at Unchained, their last episode, it's on one of the CryptoPunks talks about the whole difference, what these things are, and it's literally the podcast is called Unchained, and it's literally the last one that they did. Is a great overview of that stuff.
Okay. Next up is the Boeing 737 crashes vertically into a mountain in China with 132 people on board. Everyone on board is feared to be dead, but specifics are still unknown as this is still very late breaking news of a Boeing 737 that was flying for a Chinese airline has crashed, and everyone on board is assumed to be dead. And there's video of it, of course, in the age of everyone having a camera in their pocket at all the times. Pretty much anything is caught now, and that's really unfortunate. Clearly, the Boeing 737 is still not yet ready for prime time. The next is from Bibi from Reuters that says, pressed to choose sides on Ukraine, China trade favors the West. And that is an absolutely interesting dinner party conversation point right there. Despite growing trade ties to Southeast Asia and an economy less dependent on trade over the past decade, China's economic interests remain heavily skewed toward Western democracies. This is such an interesting point that the U.S. does enough, and the West, let's say Europe and America and all of its allies, collectively, including Australia, the UK, everybody, do enough business with China that they could potentially force China to step away from Russia, for example. If if the West generally, with a capital W, collectively threatens to withdraw business with China, they could force China on this point. Pressed to choose sides on Ukraine, China might be forced to choose the West. It's such a valid point, interesting point. There it is. So thank you for that.
And China yesterday announced another 10 million for Red Cross to Ukraine, the humanitarian aid again.
Right. Because you better believe they are understandably anxious that there could potentially be a growing a growing sentiment, anti-Chinese sentiment, for if they appear to be too favorable of Russia in this invasion. And they are correct in trying to watch and measure the real-time sentiment if people start, questioning if China's, too in favor of Russia in this. And then the sad reality is, they're making very minor gestures and publicly claiming and posturing and kind of painting the image that they're pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia, while there's rather interesting articles documenting that China behind the scenes is using their state-backed hackers to attack Ukrainian infrastructure through hacking and etc. And that's quite concerning.
Tyler, I mean that's kind of so. I'll say it.
Yeah.
Globalization, as we've known it, is dead. It's going
Oh.
from this Russia was a big trigger. There were a bunch of much smaller. I mean, I won't even say much smaller. There are a myriad of smaller triggers, you might say, with regards to that that Xi Jinping's been setting forth. But now, just the general, risk management responsibility for a bunch of different people who are managing their sourcing strategies. Moving forward, as of all the risk that's been put on the table with regards to authoritarianism generally, but then of course you got to get really hyper specific with regards to where you are in the supply chain. But I think that's something, the decoupling that we've kind of spoken to is real, and it's going to become more and more real. So what are the implications of that? There's going to be a bunch of sectors that have to deal with a bunch of things. We talk a lot about semiconductors. Food is becoming an issue here because that's going to be a pretty crucial thing in wartime. But But there's also the Mama Gaia. There's the planet and the cost that we've paid for shipping things halfway around the world from a carbon footprint perspective. You know, the more shift to a more local, regional, regenerative supply chain. If we're trying to feel, we're struggling to try to find silver linings in the context of war. I would say that I would offer that humanity, the way that we live our lives is we have another opportunity to kind of look at how we can harmonize with our natural resources more as this globalization turns a page. And I just wanted to state that because that's definitely an opportunity for humanity to start to find ways to live with a smaller footprint.
Okay. Next up
I don't
from
think it's necessarily dead, but maybe it's evolving into something else.
yep, Peter Zeihan's Disunited Nations. Read it. The next is from Amay, that Honduras is reportedly ready to officially recognize Bitcoin as legal tender in coming days. Honduras might be the next nation after El Salvador to formally recognize Bitcoin as legal tender if various internet sources are to be believed. Well, let's see if that does happen. That's indeed an interesting development, which could, as we said with El Salvador, lead to a sort of domino-like effect in LATAM, as there's sort of a fraternity, sorority-like nature of the LATAM countries and a kind of friendly camaraderie. And if things are at least going, if there's any sort of net benefit to what's happening in El Salvador, then Honduras makes a whole lot of sense. And if that works, then and by the way, having a second country, a trading partner who, nearby, where you could do that in Bitcoin, that gets very, very interesting very, very quickly. And you could see, it would not surprise me at all that Latin America would be the place where this could and might happen.
Question.
Yes.
Hey, Tyler.
For either you or Ame, I thought last week France announced that they also recognize Bitcoin as
I
legal
I,
tender.
rem- I
Is that
remember
true?
I remember that article, and it sounded a bit fantastical to me, but it seemed reputable. But I haven't seen anything else about it. I wonder if May did.
Hey, Tyler. I could add a
Yes.
little bit to this.
No, but I could look into it on this side of the pond. Lewis was going to say something as well.
Go ahead, Liz.
Sorry about that. No, just real quick. So I just spent the last 2 weeks in Mexico,
Yeah.
working on a similar thing. The progress we're making in TJ has been a very difficult learning experience of how we have to educate them. However, out of Cabo San Lucas, we've made incredible progress. There are a strong community out of Mexico's Cabo San Lucas that are very crypto knowledgeable. They've built programs, nonprofit organizations, and I feel comfortable, not necessarily confident, but comfortable that it's penetrating in the educational part for Mexico coming out of Baja California. And I would not be surprised if this slowly continues to go forward with the other countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, and countries like that, because now it's going to become a competitive step forward on who's going to onboard forward and forthcoming. And I'm driving home right now from TJ as I speak. So that's what we were doing this week. Thanks.
Hold on a second. When you say driving home, you mean to San Diego?
No, I live in Camarillo. I just passed San
Oh,
Diego about an hour ago. I
okay.
literally spent 2 weeks in TJ doing this.
Okay, cool. Alrighty. So the next one's from BB OneWeb, the internet satellite company, to launch satellites with SpaceX after suspending ties with the Russian agency that they were dependent on. OneWeb will resume satellite launches with Elon Musk's SpaceX, the British satellite communications company, said on Monday. That's a tricky situation to be in because you're competing with SpaceX's own native Starlink system.
What about those Russian cosmonauts who showed up at the space station dressing in oddly Ukrainian colors? I think that was an interesting move. As a joke, that's one way to get out of Russia. We talked last time, or you mentioned last time, that Putin was restricting travel for anyone who worked at Space Cosmos. I guess one way to leave Russia now, if you work at Space Cosmos, is to quite literally take a rocket out of Russia and then maybe have some more freedom up there in space. But interesting to see the political statement, although their commentary was a little bit like, oh yeah, we just had extra materials lying around in the factory, so they didn't actually outright make a political statement, but it seemed to be one.
Okay, speaking of
It is the colors of their school, their alma mater. That's why it's just a regular yellow.
okay,
We look too deep into it.
speaking of Russia for a second, there's a headline that from the Telegraph that Putin is accused of mass abductions of Ukrainian citizens. On Sunday night, Moscow gave Ukraine a deadline to surrender Mariupol as gun battles raged over the city. However, Russia has been accused of rounding up citizens and residents, sending them to remote cities hundreds of miles from the border into Russia. And the Telegraph is reporting this
Another
now.
gulag.
Right. Well, the point is that these people are being sent into Russia, and it's not known where they're going. That I believe it was the mayor of Mariupol is claiming that citizens are being abducted and sent into Russia, and not knowing exactly where they're going. So no doubt that's going to become a hot story. People are going to investigate that. The next is from Katerina, that faster technique for resetting qubits in quantum computers. Simulation suggests a new technique for resetting qubits in a quantum computer without harming them. Rebooting the quantum computer is tricky, and indeed the quantum computer evolution proceeds unabated, as that's what we as the ants are collectively doing, is building the AI and the quantum computers, as we are programmed to do. So we're going to continue to make progress on that. The next is from our friend Vinay from India Today, that a Chinese drone was found near the India-Bangladesh border in West Bengal. A drone reportedly made in China has been found in a village field near the India-Bangladesh border in West Bengal. And the next is from Bibi from CNN, that Russian internet users are learning to beat Putin's internet crackdown. The digital Iron Curtain may be descending on Russia as Putin struggles to control the narrative about his war in Ukraine, and people are turning to Signal, which is encrypted, to be able to circumvent that. That's kind of the natural evolution of things. And the next is, and the last one that I have for today is from Lucia, that NFTs are coming to Spotify, as there's now an open job listing on Spotify's job board for Web3 developers. And that implies, at least, that that NFTs might be in the future of Spotify. And that is a really interesting potential possibility. For what could NFTs in an audio context be? You could use NFTs for access to live events and virtual events and virtual goods and all kinds of things. So watch out for Spotify to evolve into a platform far beyond just audio content distribution. It could be and will be more about enabling content creators, of which Spotify has a few, like Beyonce and Jay, everybody. And all of those millions of incredibly popular content creators will now be able to use that platform to sell all kinds of interesting content to their fans, both virtual and real.
Aren't they already doing that?
They're in the testing stages of that, yeah, and they already have the analytics in the background.
No, I mean, they're already doing that. They're already selling this kind of stuff to people, and they don't need NFTs to start selling them again.
Right, but there could be interesting opportunities that are enabled by the NFTs uniquely, which is worth investigating and testing, especially to proactively, preemptively prevent those artists from seeking out. For example, if Spotify doesn't embrace NFTs and somebody else does, they don't want to risk losing their artists, to other platforms that enable that. So they're going to test that shit
All
out.
right, so they're diversifying.
Yeah. Well, they just at least want to have it on board as an option ready to go in the event that somebody else offers it and artists are looking too seriously at that. So anyway, there you go. We'll pause there.
I just have this, sensitivity towards, a lot of times we hear people saying, "Oh, this is going to solve this problem." We already have a solution for this problem. This is another solution that is not necessarily trivial, but it's a good solution for a problem that is already solved. Like,
Yes, the
especially
buzzwords,
for
the buzzwords.
yeah.
It's just the buzzwords, yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right, everybody. We'll
Thank you,
do it
guys.
again tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Enjoy your
Tyler.
stay in Stockholm, Tyler. Stay
Have a
Yeah.
happy
safe.
Monday.
Stay
Take
safe.
care, everybody.
Everybody.
Rip to the, you know.